Chapter 10 of Ruth Erskine's Crosses. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ruth Erskine's Crosses by Pansy. Chapter 10. Other People's Crosses. One could not live long in this world without realizing the forcefulness of the sentence, "Every heart knoweth his own bitterness." Behind the sunniest, apparently most enviable life the bitterness hides. It will not be supposed that Marian Dennis's life, which, to Ruth's narrow vision, had blossomed into perfect coloring, was an exception to the general rule. As she stands in her pretty dining room, waiting for the coming of her husband, and gazes out of the window at the play of light and shade in the western sky, gazes with that far-away, thoughtful, half-sad look, which betokens that the gazer's thoughts are not upon the picture which her eyes behold, it is plain, to the most careless glance, that a tinge of somber hue has already shaded the picture of her life. She had been through an ordeal of calls that afternoon; not calls from intimate and congenial friends, who came because they desired the pleasure of a visit with her, but from some of those who came, as in custom bound, to pay a ceremonious visit to the new wife of their pastor. They had not been helpful callers. Without offending any of the set rules which are supposed to govern polite society, they had yet contrived to make Marian feel that they were keen-sighted, keen-scented society spies, with eyes all about them, and ears alert to hear, or to fancy what they could. Also, they had been people, some of them, who delighted in what they termed plain speaking, which is ofttimes decorous insult, if that expression is not a misnomer. There are people not quite coarse enough to express adverse criticism directly to a man's face, and such are apt to resort to the more refined coarseness of making their criticism into the form of a joke and aiming it at the face of his wife. With one or two such persons had Marian come in contact. "I hope you have Dr. Dennis in good subjection," Mrs. Easterly had said, with a peculiar little laugh that was meant to be merry, and that jarred, without one's being able to define why. "There is nothing like being right, you know. I told Mr. Easterly, last evening, I was afraid you would be too lenient with him. He is positively in danger of keeping us in prayer meeting until it is time to be thinking about the next morning's breakfast. Mr. Easterly said, when he got him a wife, home would be more attractive to him. But my dear Mrs. Dennis, you must have observed that there was no improvement last evening." "I observed that he was 5 minutes past the hour," Marian said, and, if Mrs. Easterly had been familiar with her voice, she would have discovered that it was haughty in the extreme. "Dr. Dennis is very particular to close promptly, and, when I questioned him, he said the people were tardy about getting in, and so delayed the opening." "Possible that it was only 5 minutes! I could have been positive it was 15," Mrs. Easterly said, ignoring the explanation, and the statement about general punctuality. Such people always ignore remarks that are not easy to be answered. Then the smooth voice went on. "I think a clergyman ought to try to cultivate habits of punctuality about closing, as well as opening meetings, so many people are overwearied by long drawn-out exercises." "As, for instance, lectures by infidels and the like," remarks Marian, still with the dryness of tone that those familiar to her understand, and calling to mind the fact that she had heard of Mrs. Easterly as a delighted listener, for an hour and 3/4, to the popular infidel orator 2 evenings before. "Oh, lectures! Why, of course, they have a set time. Every one knows they must be lengthy. They have abstruse themes to handle, and many classes of hearers to please." "But the mere commonplaces of a prayer meeting can be compressed into small compass, as well as not, the theme of personal salvation not being supposed to be of much importance, nor very abstruse, I suppose." Mrs. Easterly arched her eyebrows, said nothing because she didn't know what to say, made the rest of her stay brief, and remarked, when she had gotten out of Marian's hearing, that she had heard that Mrs. Wilbur spoken of as peculiar; having infidel tendencies, indeed. Perhaps there was a shade of truth in it. For her part, she wondered that Dr. Dennis should have been so imprudent as to have selected that sort of a wife. It is imprudent in Marian to have answered her caller in those words, or in that spirit. Sarcasm was lost on her, for she hadn't the right sort of brains to understand it. It is a curious fact that certain people, who can be very sarcastic in themselves, cannot understand or appreciate it in others. And so trivial a matter as this troubled Marion? Well, yes, it did. She had not been long in her position, you will remember. It was really her first rude awakening from the dream that all Christian people regarded their pastor with a certain reverent courtesy, not in a cringing or servile spirit, not in a spirit in any sense at variance with true independence of thought and action, but in the chivalrous spirit of the olden time, reverencing the office rather than the man, and according all possible courtesy to the man because of the position he held as ambassador from the King's court. Marion's early childhood had been spent among simple, earnest Christians, Christians whose reverent spirit had been an outgrowth of Puritan New England, and, while her later years had passed among a very different class of people, she yet had clung to the fancy that Christians everywhere cherished the bond of relationship, the tie stronger than that of blood, and spoke wisely and with respect of those who belonged, like themselves, to the royal family. Mrs. Easterly's words had jarred, not only because Dr. Dennis was her husband, but because he was a clergyman, and because he was Mrs. Easterly's pastor. Much had she to learn, you will observe. She was more than likely to meet often with people to whom the word pastor meant less than any other title, meant, if they took time to analyze their own feelings, one to whom they could be rude, or free, or insultingly inquisitive, without fear of rousing him to resentment, because resentment is not a becoming trait in the ministry. Dr. Dennis would have smiled could he have known the turmoil in his wife's heart. He had so long ago passed beyond that, had so long ago decided that people must be ranked in classes, so many from this strip of humanity who do not know the difference between frankness and rudeness, so many in this strip who, because of their lack of early education, must not be expected to know certain things, so many in this strip to whom he could talk, freely, familiarly, as brother to brother and friend to friend, classified Christians, belonging to the family indeed, but having such different degrees of likeness to the family name that, what was a matter of course from one, was a sting from the other. All these things Dr. Dennis knew. All these things his wife had still to learn. She was willing to learn, and she was not so foolish as to suppose that her road was strewn with roses. But, all the same, the tiny thorn pricked her. There were other and graver troubles than this. Do you remember how she pleased her fancy, while yet she was an inhabitant of that dingy third-story room, as to the dainty little teas she would get for that young daughter of hers? Here it was, the very perfection of a tea-table, exquisite and delicate and fascinating in all its appointments, laid for three, yet presently, when Dr. Dennis came from his round of calls and seated himself opposite his wife, and waited, and then finally sent a messenger to Gracie's room, who returned with the message, "Miss Grace says you will please excuse her this evening, she doesn't care for any tea," his face clouded as though the answer brought trouble to his heart. "Have you had further talk with Grace?" he asked his wife, when the door had closed on the servant. "A little. There have been callers most of the time, but I talked with her a few minutes." "What did she say?" Marion would rather he had not asked the question. She hesitated a little, then said, with an effort to speak lightly, "She said what was natural enough, that she thought I knew almost too much about the matter, and might have been content to leave it to you." "I will not have her speaking in that manner to you," he said, his face growing graver, and his forehead settling into a frown. "She ought to know better." "I know it," answered Marion, a little dash of brightness in her voice. "She ought to be perfect, of course, and not give way in this undignified manner. It is only such old saints as you and I who have any right to get out of tone when things do not go just to suit us." He laughed a little, then he said, "Now, Marion, you know she has tried you very much, and without cause." "As to that, I suppose if you and I could see into her heart, she thinks she has sore cause. I would not make too much of it if I were you; and I would make nothing at all of the part which has to do with me. She will feel differently before very long. She is young." Then Dr. Dennis's thoughts went back to his daughter. He sighed heavily. "I ought to have shielded her better. I was trying, I thought. I am so astonished about that man. He has been a professor of religion ever since he was a child." "To profess a thing is not always to possess it," Marion said, and then she sighed to think that even in religion this was so true. And she sighed again to realize that in her hard life she had come more in contact with people who professed without possessing than her husband had. The trouble about Gracie was not so light as she had tried to make it appear to the father. Neither had her attempt to reason the obstinate young daughter into something like graceful yielding been so free from self-pain as she would have him think. It was all about Professor Ellis, a man who, as Marion expressed it to her husband, was good enough for a teacher, but not at all the sort of man for one so young and so impressible as Gracie to ride away with to an evening entertainment. "He is the only one that I have been in the habit of allowing her to ride with," the doctor had said, aghast, and then had followed, on Marion's part, a startled exclamation to the effect that she would have trusted her sooner with a dozen of the boys with whom she had not been allowed to associate. "They are better than he," she said, earnestly, and then had followed a long confidential talk, which had ended in the peremptory and by no means wisely put, negative to Gracie's plans; and then had followed, on her part, questionings and surmises, until at last she understood that this new mother, who had been but a little while ago a stranger to them both, had come between her father and herself, and then had followed, as any one of sense might have known there would, a scene which was by no means complimentary to Gracie, or comforting to the new mother. She had tried to be wise. "Gracie," she had said, in her gentlest tone, "you know I am a good many years older than you, and I have known Professor Ellis very well, and I am sure if you realized just the sort of a man he is, you would not care to be his familiar friend." "I don't want to be his familiar friend," Gracie had said, haughtily. "I want to take a ride out to Katie's with him when I have promised to do so." And then her eyes had fallen under the calm of Marion's searching gaze, and her tones had faltered. "At least I do not see that riding out with him is a proof of very great friendship. It is no more than I have done several times with my father's permission." "But your father was deceived in him, Gracie. He had no means of knowing the sort of man he is, save by his professions, which have been nothing but professions for years. Gracie, I know that of him which should make every young girl unwilling to be seen in his society, or considered his friend." Whereupon Gracie's eyes had flashed indignation for a second, then settled into sullenness, while she answered coldly, "I should think my father ought to have been capable of judging character a little. He has had something to do with men and life. I do not know why I should not be able to trust myself to his judgment." Marion smiled. It was hard to be patient with this girl. The haughty way in which she retired behind her dignity and said, "My father," seemed designed to shut Marion out from ownership in him, and impress her with the sense of the newness of her acquaintance with and entrance into the family. "Gracie," she said again, after a thoughtful pause, "it may not be known to you that there have been recent developments about Professor Ellis that make him an undesirable friend for you. I know that, as your teacher, you have learned to look up to and respect him, but he is in some respects unworthy." There was for a few minutes no response from the sullen-browed girl, with her head bent low over the slate, as if during the intervals of this conversation she had eyes and thought only for the intricate problem before her. Presently she said, in exactly the same tone of repressed indignation which she had used before, "I repeat that in my judgment my father is just as capable of deciding as to what gentlemen are suited to be my friends as a stranger can be." Marion drew back quickly. She caught her breath hard. This was a trying spot. What should she do or say? What would Ruth Erskine have done in her place? At the same time, there was a sense of relief in believing that this young girl's pride only was touched, not her heart. She was simply rebellious that a stranger, as she chose to call her, should presume to interfere with her friendships. "I am not a stranger, Gracie," she said, trying to speak in all gentleness. "I am your father's wife, and have at his request assumed responsibilities concerning you, for which I am answerable not only to him, but to God. When I tell you, therefore, what your father has had no means of knowing until lately, that Professor Ellis is the sort of man whom a young lady should shun, you ought to believe me, and to understand that my sole motive is your welfare." Then was Marion Dennis treated to a brilliant flashing of the handsome eyes of her daughter. The slate and book slid to the floor with an unheeded crash, as Gracie, rising and drawing up her tall form till it equaled her mother's, said, in tones of suppressed passion: "Marion Wilbur, you have no right to speak in that manner of Professor Ellis, and I will not bear it." Then Marion Dennis drew back grieved and frightened, not at her own thrust, that was but the ill temper of an angry girl, but because she began to fear that this man, this wolf in sheep's clothing, whose chief entertainment hitherto had been to see how well he could play with human hearts, had dared to try his powers on Gracie Dennis. "I hope he will suffer for this," she said, under her breath. In the meantime, what was to be said to the angry girl, whose passion had culminated in this outburst, and who had then thrown herself back into the chair, not weeping, not crushed and bleeding, but excitedly angry; and yet, feeling that she had said a very unwise and dangerous thing and must answer for it, and yet, not caring just now in what way she might be called upon to answer. Being still in the mood to be glad that she had said it, she expected severity, and waited for it. "Gracie," said Marion, bending toward her, and I do not know that her voice had ever been gentler, or her manner more quiet, "you do not mean to hurt me. I know you do not. We are too nearly related. We are sisters, and the Lord Jesus Christ is our elder brother. It is to him that I ask you to listen. It is to his judgment, not mine, that I ask you to defer. Will you lay this matter before him, and wait on your knees for his answer, and abide by it, never minding me? If you will, the whole matter will be righted." Then she turned from her and went down to receive those calls, and get those little thrusts and pin-pricks, which pricked so much deeper, and left a keener sting because in general they were leveled at her husband instead of herself. Then she went out to that pretty table laid for three, and saw the grave-faced father, and heard his self-reproaches, and held back that which would have made him indignant in the extreme, and held back her own little sigh, and realized that life was not all sweetness, even while Ruth sat at home and envied her the brightness of her lot. Chapter 11. Recording by Trisha G.